Tuesday night means we have a question and answer session. The only difference from normal is that the location is Bodhipala Monastery in South Australia. We have a little bit of rain tonight, which is welcome for the trees. So, some questions. First question. In the practice of Anapanasati, the Buddha mentioned about knowing the long and the short breath when we breathe in and out. Then there's also the natural breathing. How to practice knowing the long breath as the long breath, and the short breath as the short, and the natural as the natural. Well, anapanasati, sati, recollection, keeping in mind, or nowadays we use the word mindfulness, but paying attention to or keeping in mind, recollecting anapana, the in and out breath. So, as far as I know, from the time of the Buddha, they practice focusing on the sensation of the breathing at this spot, the upper lip, just before the nostrils, before the air enters the body. And the Buddha gave the instruction, find a quiet place, secluded quiet place, the best you can manage. So it could be a quiet room even in a house with other people. Sit up straight, because that helps to energize the body. And then the practitioner establishes mindfulness or recollects the breath. And you know the breath as it goes in, so you pick it up here. And there's a beginning, there's a middle. And before you breathe out again, there's a pause, and then you breathe out. The way I see it, which may be wrong, but it's worked for me so far, is the long breath, the short breath, it's just pointing out the fact that our breathing rhythms and patterns can change. And sometimes we breathe short, sometimes our breath is longer. So it's not necessarily that the Buddha was teaching a breath control method as in some traditions, but he's pointing out the fact that our breathing does change depending on the situation, what's happening physically and mentally. And so, there'll be times when we have shorter breath, times when the breath is longer. So when the breath is short, you know it's short, and you know the beginning and the middle and the end of the breath. When it's long, you know the beginning, middle, and end of the breath. And it's not necessarily for you to control this, so you're just knowing the breath as it is. So sometimes it will be shorter, sometimes longer, but it's all covered. So then the natural breath, well, the natural breath is the same old breath, but it sometimes is short and sometimes long, sometimes coarse, sometimes refined. And these changes partly are to do with physical posture and activity. So of course, when you're doing a lot of exercise, your breath often becomes shorter, coarser, because you've got to absorb more oxygen. So if then you've been exercising or working physically, and then you turn to pay attention to your breath, you'll notice it's a certain way. It's coarse, it's faster and shorter. When we are sitting still and the body is still, the mind calms down, the body calms down, the breath tends to become subtler, more refined, and often longer. And of course we know when mindfulness becomes more continuous, we're paying attention to the breath going in, breath going out. It becomes more refined, more subtle, and eventually you can get to a point where it seems to have disappeared and you can't detect the movement in or out anymore. That's not because you're asleep or dull, although sleepiness and dullness can arise, of course. It's simply the body rhythm and movement of the breath has become very subtle because your whole body and mind has become calm, relaxed, and still. But the important thing is to maintain awareness, recollect the breath, keep it in mind from moment to moment. So you know if it's short, you know that. If it's long, it's long. So you've got every kind of breath that you can experience covered. So when we say the natural breath, I'm not sure what the natural breath is in the sense that it's just the breath. And that breath can be long or short depending on the situation. But you're not aiming to control the breath or make it long or short. I mean, you can experiment doing that, and people do, because if you're meditating on the breath, well, there's room to learn and experiment. So some people do take up a very short breathing rhythm. So they deliberately breathe short. Just as like when you're exercising, because they find that helps to keep the mind with the breath. So you can try that, but you'll probably find after a while it's tiring to do that, because it's unnatural, it's forced. But still, it can be something that some people benefit from, a way. Other people deliberately take long breaths, deep, long breaths, and they find that helps to calm the mind down, brings mindfulness. But again, because it's an unnatural, forcing the breath to be long, it's hard to sustain. So if the breath by itself is long or short, well, that's okay, because that tends to be just the body doing its thing and you're becoming mindful of it. But if you do a forced kind of long breath, forced short breath, you may find that difficult to sustain over time and you get tired. The other thing is you're finding one point, this point here maybe. And it's not to say you can't pay attention to the chest or the abdomen, which, there are different traditions here, but the original teaching was to pay attention to this point. This is how my teacher Ajahn Kalyano taught. And the simile is of a saw, a carpenter's saw. So when you're sawing a log or a piece of wood, in order to cut through that wood, your saw is only actually touching the wood at one point, even though you have the whole movement of the arm and the saw. The teeth of the saw are just hitting or coming into contact with the wood at one point. And that's why the wood starts to be cut through, disappears, you get sawdust. Because there's contact at this one point, back and forth, back and forth. And so when you're focusing on the breath, it's like that. You're focusing on the one point, so you know the breath going in, but you don't have to follow the sensation all the way in. And the breath out, you're picking it up at this one point. So you're giving your mind something very simple and straightforward, a straightforward task. It's just to keep its attention in this one point with a balanced effort, so you're not forcing your mind, because that tends, people try to crush the mind and force it into one spot because they don't want to get distracted. And they often find that brings them pain or some kind of reaction in the body. So you're not forcing the mind, but just through continuous, balanced effort, you're putting attention on the breath at this one point. And we say you have the factors of samadhi, vitakka, vichara. You're lifting the mind to this sensation of the breath going in, breath going out. And you're keeping your attention there. So as you're doing this, lifting the mind up, putting the mind onto the breath or the sensation of the breath, and then keeping it there, your doubts and your sleepiness fade, and body and mind start to relax. So then you have the rapture starts to arise, sukha, contentment, happiness, and then ekakata, one-pointedness. In the beginning, people will sometimes count to help, just to keep the mind on the breath. So count one breath in, one breath out, two breath in, two breath out, up until 10, and go back to 1 again. But as your mind begins to stay with the breath, it knows the breath, it's staying with the breath, knows the breath that is long, breath is short, the counting becomes superfluous, too much, we don't need it. So then we just stay with that one spot, and all your energy seems to gather in that one spot. So this is the basic practice of Anapanasati, the beginning, and we're developing that. And they say, know the breath body, which is quite often translated as knowing the body of the breath, meaning the whole breath. So you're not losing mindfulness, or your mindfulness is not wavering. You're there at this point throughout the whole breath in and the whole breath out, the whole body of the breath. And you'll notice if you're practicing mindfulness of breathing, your mind is so fast and distractions come up so quickly. You breathe in, and as you're pausing, you haven't even breathed out yet. Already your mind is gone, caught up in a train of thought, or you hear a sound, or you look, you see something, so you're looking, you've lost awareness, lost your mindfulness of the breath. You're not clearly comprehending the breath, you don't know whether it's coming in, going out at that point. And it can be that quick, can't it? In one moment your mind is gone, distracted by something. So we really need to practice this and know the whole breath from start to finish, whether it's long, short, or natural. Whatever title, whatever description you give it, you're knowing it as it is. In, out. And you keep doing it, and this repetition of the practice of keeping the breath in mind, paying attention to it, and knowing, fully comprehending the breath, the qualities of the breath, the sensation, whether it's going in, whether it's going out, brings the mind to samadhi. And from there we also get a basis for developing insight into the 3 universal characteristics: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self, or anicca, dukkha, anatta. So the practice of breath meditation can lead all the way to nibbana, and so as far as we know, on the night of his enlightenment, the Buddha himself used this. It's not the only meditation, of course, but it's a very suitable meditation to try with, because we all have breath. Of course, there can be impediments. You can get flu, colds, sinus conditions, mucus, coughs and colds tend to make it harder to practice mindfulness of breathing, but not impossible. And other health conditions can have an effect on your breathing, so sometimes you may have to adapt and use other meditation objects. But still, we all have the breath. It's there, it's free, it's available for us to use for our own advantage and for the benefit of others as well. So do it a lot. That's what the Buddha said. Practice a lot, do it a lot, and it will bring great benefit, great fruit and great benefit. So if you want to do something really good for yourself or others, Anapanasati is one way that you will fulfill that wish. You have the aspiration to improve your life or improve the life of others. Practicing Anapanasati, developing that, will bring you that great fruit and great benefit. So another question. Why do some people turn away from the Dhamma after practicing for many years? A good question. Why do they? Why would they? Well, one of the sort of central teachings of the Buddha and sort of guiding principles is that you're training yourself or developing yourself in the practice of Dhamma. This Eightfold Noble Path we just chanted, Sila, Samadhi, Panya in short, to the point where the kind of qualities and insights that you develop stick. Your mind develops to a point where the Dhamma that you've developed, the morality, the calm, the insight doesn't disappear. It doesn't fade, it doesn't degenerate. And so one of the ways we talk about the first stage of enlightenment, one who's entered the stream of the Dhamma, the Sotapanna, one of the important things is that what they've understood, realized, no longer disappears from their mind. The quality of their mind doesn't degenerate, and so they no longer are subject to rebirth in the lower realms, hell realms, ghost realms, animal realms, realms of suffering. The Sotapanna will have a maximum 7 lifetimes, and then they reach enlightenment, and sometimes 3 lifetimes, and maybe sometimes 1 lifetime already they reach enlightenment. But their mind will no longer degenerate to the point where they make heavy karma, breaking precepts, hurting people, hurting themselves, getting caught into coarse wrong views, so they won't slip back to doing things, saying things that will lead to rebirth in the lower realms and extreme states of suffering. They've removed enough of their mental kilesas for that not to happen anymore. And their view of the Dhamma and their faith and their understanding of the Dhamma practice is established. But until that point, there's always a chance we can get caught into wrong views, wrong ways of behavior, wrong conduct that will lead to more suffering, more confusion, more ignorance, more attachment. So there's no guarantee of what will happen until one has entered the stream of the Dhamma, entered the Arya path. So this is an important principle. We're practicing to make this mind firm in the Dhamma. Unshakable peace, unshakable insight, unshakable morality. So that even when we're tempted or provoked, we don't give up our sila, our morality, our virtuous conduct. We don't give up our mindfulness, we don't give up our right view. And so people practicing the path, maybe even monks, sometimes after many years they kind of turn away from the Dhamma, maybe they even disrobe sometimes, because the various qualities of the path are not yet fully established in their heart, in their mind. So they can stray, they can give up, they can get caught into depression. As they get older, turn away from the Dhamma, their faith can kind of drain away sometimes. So whether it's a monk or a lay person, it's possible. Maybe you haven't developed strong insight or understanding, and then haven't developed strong faith. So faith is shaky, insight is shaky, and of course morality can be shaky. So people make mistakes, get lost in unskillful ways. And this can happen really at any time. I remember Ajahn Sumedho used to talk about his first teacher, the monk Prat Somai, who he had great gratitude for, because this monk took him to Ajahn Chah to start training and practicing with Ajahn Chah. He'd been in Nong Khai, further north in northeast Thailand, and he'd met Prat Somai, who I think could speak a bit of English, and he suggested he go and stay with Ajahn Chah and would benefit from that. So Ajahn Sumedho says he's very grateful to that monk. But later that monk disrobed. While he was a monk, he tried to be very strict and disciplined, so he obviously put effort into his practice. He'd learnt the rules and many aspects of the Dhamma, and he was very strict, so he's quite unhappy monk because he's always critical of others, which maybe is a point. As we practice the Dhamma, we have to be careful that we don't get too conceited or have too many opinions and views that we attach to, because that can make us unhappy even though we have faith and we're putting effort into the practice. So in his case, he was very strict and very, very restrained, but eventually he disrobed. And other monks said, well, maybe he didn't develop much peace or insight from his meditation. He was just depending on the strict discipline of the monk to stay in the robes. But eventually he left the robes. And then a while later, maybe a few years later, I'm not quite sure how long, Ajahn Sumedho, who was a young monk in those days, heard that this monk Samai is now a layman, had just become a drunk, and people found him lying drunk by a shop, and he'd really fallen on hard times, had no money, no family, he was just become a drunkard. So Ajahn Sumedho, the young Ajahn Sumedho, was talking to Ajahn Chah about this and saying, it's such a shame that this man fell away from the Dhamma, and look, now he's a drunkard. And Ajahn Sumedho was feeling sad about that and expressing some feelings about this. And Ajahn Chah said, well, now that monk has become your teacher, or ex-monk, he's become your teacher, because when you feel disapproval or disappointment when you hear the news that this monk has now become a drunkard, that's teaching you something, to let go, to accept the truth, a difficult truth to accept, but you have to accept it. You shouldn't be creating suffering out of this. You can practice kindness and compassion to this person who's helped you in the past, but don't let it be a cause for your own degeneration from the Dhamma and your own unwholesome states of mind to arise. And later on, the ex-monk actually died, and they heard the news he'd died. He hadn't been living very skillfully, he died from whatever reason. And Ajahn Chah said again, now you have to share merits with this ex-monk who died. You have gratitude to him. The last part of his life was pretty miserable. So now you can share the merits of your practice, chant for him, meditate for him, which is what we do for the dead. And it can happen. Monks can fall away from the Dhamma. We say they run out of steam, run out of faith, run out of energy, run out of insight. Maybe they haven't meditated much, and so they disrobe. Sometimes they fall in love. They meet someone who they fall in love with and leave the monk's life. And lay people are the same. Lay people can be inspired for a period of time. Sometimes their inspiration and faith is linked to a teacher who they meet, and then the teacher moves away or disrobes or whatever, and their faith crashes as the teacher leaves. Sometimes it's other things, like illness can be a cause. You move away from the Dhamma. Sometimes we have our own doubts. We have the sufferings of life, and we feel the Dhamma is not solving our problems well enough. Maybe it's our own efforts in the practice are actually not that much. We haven't really put much effort to learn the Dhamma, practice the Dhamma, but still we may attribute our loss of good fortune, our problems, to the failure of the Dhamma to help us. And sometimes people blame the Buddha, but sometimes they blame the Dhamma. Sometimes they blame the Sangha. And that may be a factor. There may be a factor to do with, say, a teacher who disrobes or a teacher leaves and we don't see them anymore. But more likely it's our own efforts have faded. We didn't sustain our effort in the practice. But sometimes misunderstanding happens and people blame Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha for their suffering. And this comes up especially with illness, and if someone loses a job or becomes depressed, sometimes they say, oh, the Buddha didn't help me, or the Dhamma didn't help me. Look, I've got ill and I meditated and asked the Buddha for help, but the Buddha didn't help me. And they sort of turn away from Buddhism. Perhaps they were asking the impossible, or their expectations were not realistic. because everyone can get ill. You may have strong faith in the Buddha, and that will help you through your illness. And if you practice the Dhamma, it may help you to keep a good state of mind and reflect on your situation. But if you're not practicing, then you may just say, well, Buddhism hasn't helped me and I'm ill now, and you get overwhelmed by the pain, discomfort and disappointment of your illness. So there's a number of different reasons people turn away from the Dhamma. They feel it hasn't helped them. Sometimes they have a friend or someone convinces them there's another religion that's better for them. Or sometimes they don't keep the precepts, so their mind really goes downhill very far. Like that monk in the story, he just became alcoholic. So people can become alcoholics, drug abuse. Sometimes people just lose their way and get caught into unskillful, unwholesome ways of behavior, and so the Dhamma no longer has any meaning for them. There's a number of different factors, so it can happen. As long as we're unenlightened, the mind can slip back. And that's the danger, and that's the kind of danger the Buddha said we should reflect on every day. I can still slip back, can be reborn in the lower realms, I can experience lots of suffering in this life if I don't practice and look after my mind, don't make good karma. It can happen, so it's a danger to reflect on, to keep you alert, keep you heedful in your practice. We don't know how long we've got. We don't know how long we're going to live, when we'll die. So, for one who's investigated and reflected on this and developed some faith, they might see this is something really valuable, or the most valuable thing they have. Hearing the Dhamma, having faith in the Dhamma, that's something you want to preserve. If it's a monk, sometimes you want to preserve that with your life. You'd rather die than not practice the Dhamma. You'd rather die than break the precepts, harm people, steal, kill, whatever. You actually would rather die than go that way. That's for someone who's really committed to the Dhamma and seen the Dhamma. Then it just becomes the way they are. There's no more doubts, no more confusion, uncertainty. But until you've reached that point, there's danger that you may fall into wrong views, you may stray from the path, lose your way. So you have to be on your guard, and one of the best ways to prevent that happening is stay close to the Sangha, the teachers, practice the Dhamma every day, keep the precepts every day, and little by little your mind will become firmer, clearer, brighter. Your understanding of the truth will be established, and then you won't have many more doubts and get lost. So it does happen, unfortunately. People can fall away from the Dhamma, but our job is to make sure it doesn't happen. So another question: how can you practice when overwhelmed by a strong emotion? Well, the path of practice, we have these different kind of aspects. The first one is just basic, the restraint of conduct, what we call sila, virtuous conduct. So mindfulness of your speech, mindfulness of your actions, using the 5 precepts as a guideline. And so there'll be situations in lifetimes where sometimes unpredictably, sometimes predictably, strong emotional reactions to things come up. Fear, anger, lust, desire, greed, anxiety, sadness. Depending on the situation, strong emotions can be triggered by different things, sometimes external situations, sometimes just memories and emotions coming up as a power of your own. It's the result of your own karma from the past, and they're triggered by something, and just internally they arise, even though you're not having anything to do with anybody else, you're just on your own, and suddenly strong fear, sadness, anxiety, lust can arise. So we have to have our plan of action, our practice. So the precepts are the first plan of action. However bad it is, I'm going to try and keep the precepts. So I won't take out my strong emotion on someone else, harm them, or I won't act on it in an unskillful way. So you use the precepts as a guard, as a protection for times where you may be a bit shaky and strong emotions have come up and you're tempted to say or do something unskillful or harmful. So that's one of the benefits of the precepts. They help give you that basic composure and awareness of speech and action. And it makes your mind sensitive to how you're relating to the rest of the world, even if you have strong emotions. So you say you get really angry, if you're practicing the Dhamma, following the Buddha, you might say, well, however angry I am, I'm not going to say or do something that hurts somebody else or hurts myself. I'm going to work with this, I'll be careful, mindful in this period, this time when I'm very angry. And that comes through practice, doesn't it? You get aware of how to respond when strong emotions come up. And then also through the practice of mindfulness and meditation and investigation. Sometimes all you can do with a strong emotion for the first period anyway, as it's intense and it comes up, is just be very, very patient with it. Just endure it. And you can't yet let go of it, you can't yet get full insight into it and see it as impermanent, as not self, but you just endure it until maybe its intensity wanes, fades a bit, and then you can maybe introduce insight and establish enough mindfulness to see, this is what fear is like, this is what lust is like, this is what anxiety is like. And you're seeing it change, you're seeing it fade out, or even cease, and you can say, it's impermanent. And what's impermanent is not a self. It's a state of mind that arose through causes and conditions and passed away. But in the beginning, often all we can do is just endure. But your aim is to try and bring up the mindfulness so you can make an object out of this strong emotion. Get to the point where you can do that. And of course, emotions have different aspects to them. There's the physical feelings, strong fear, strong anger, strong lust. Physically, you have feelings come up. And then you have mental trains of thought, perceptions and views coming up, triggered by this emotion, often reinforcing old perceptions perhaps, if we're not mindful. But as you bring up mindfulness, you start to observe all of this. You're observing the feeling, and feeling arises, passes away. You're observing the thoughts and the perceptions. And what mindfulness does is give you the ability to, in a detached way, objectify your experience. So the more mindfulness and the more continuous your mindfulness is, the more you can deal with that emotion skillfully. And we say, get to the point where you can let it go without grasping at it or bringing up a strong self-identification, giving a lot of importance to it. So I always like Ajahn Chah's simile, mental states and emotions are like waves on the ocean. And you're standing on the beach watching the ocean and waves come in. So waves of emotion, elation, happiness, excitement, frustration, anger, fear and anxiety, many kinds of waves, some big, some small. But they all have this quality, is that they break on the shore and then they roll back into the ocean and disappear. And if you can maintain your mindfulness or bring up the mindfulness, then you can see emotions like this. They're breaking on the mind and then disappearing. And even the biggest emotional, traumatic, overwhelming kind of emotional state can seem like a huge wave. But even the most huge tsunami kind of wave breaks on the shore. It may cause a lot of damage, and emotions can be traumatic, damaging, difficult to deal with. But one thing is that eventually they go back into the sea and disappear. So even a tsunami will eventually disappear. So your aim is to limit the damage by bringing up the mindfulness, not acting or doing anything harmful at that time. Accept the emotion as it is. Oh, it's like this, it feels like this, makes me feel like this. But try to maintain the mindfulness and observe how it's impermanent, suffering, and it's not self. So little by little your insight is growing, and that will mean that the emotional states will come up a little less often and they will be less intense. You'll suffer less with them. So I'm just giving a general response here. Depends on the kind of emotion. Lust can be very overwhelming, so we have precepts to help us, and then contemplation of the impermanence or the unattractive aspect of whatever it is that you're lusting after. Usually, a person or the image of a person. Anger is more destructive, so you practice mindfulness, restraint when you have strong anger, not to act on it, and then gradually to bring up kindness, compassion, so that the anger fades away. Tolerance, patience with the feeling that's maybe making you want to do something. Fear is the same. Often you have to use a lot of patience, and then insight into the impermanence of that fear, and how often it's fed by our own negative thinking or unskillful thinking. And as you become mindful, you see that, so you start to undermine the fear and let it go. So a lot of our practice is centered around this. A lot of our emotions are very kind of fleeting and not very intense. But then once in a while there'll be the big tsunami, and you can use this, what you've been learning with the smaller waves of emotion. You can use the same method with the bigger wave. It's harder, isn't it? It's harder to stand and watch a tsunami. So you have to brace yourself, and you have to use a lot more qualities maybe. So the last question is, a couple of different people have requested, can I talk about Lumpur Wan Suchino, who was one of the older disciples of Ajahn Mun. He's behind me on the wall, Ajahn Mun, the grandfather of forest monks. Lumpur Wan, I think I talked about him about a year ago on one of these Q&A sessions, but I'll just say a few more things about him tonight, because I can remember. I never met him. The year I arrived in Thailand, he died. So I never met him personally, but I met his students, and probably the one student I knew quite well was Lumpur Blien. Lumpur Blien lived with him for about 11 years at the monastery where Lumpur Blien lived and died. Wat Aranya Vivek in Chiang Mai. So Lumpur Wan is famous for living, especially the last part of his life, in the Chiang Mai region. He moved from the monastery where Lumpur Blien lived and practiced a few years before he died. At the age of 75, he walked to another monastery, which became his final resting place, where his current chedi is, where his relics are kept, Wat Doi Me Bang. And that's quite a long way, quite a long walk. I can't remember if it's as much as 100 kilometers, but it's certainly close to. And he was 75 years old, and he walked there very quickly in a day or two, even though he was already quite ill. And that kind of was something that was how he lived his life, his last few years, how he'd still walked from one monastery to the other. He spent his whole life as a monk on Tudong, we say, wandering the forests of Thailand, Laos, Burma, even over to India. He was a wanderer. So he was born in northeast Thailand, in Udon province, in the late 19th century. So we're talking about 130 years ago, a long time ago now. Into a typical kind of farming family who had strong faith in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. They were Buddhists. And, in those days, very poor farming communities in northeast Thailand, very little medical health. So there's a lot of illness and death. So at the age of about 5, I seem to remember, his mother died. But before she died, she encouraged him to become a monk. She'd had an insight that he was somebody with special qualities as a child. She loved her child, obviously. And he had this bright, radiant skin. They say he had a kind of glow around him already from his childhood. So his mother encouraged him to ordain and told him not to disrobe, which was good for him. Not all mothers think in the same way. Some mothers do the opposite and say, whatever you do, don't become a monk. But he was encouraged to become a monk from a very young age. She died. And he said that really affected him. Losing your mother at a young age can often bring you to see many aspects of truth, of the Dhamma, see the impermanence of life, the suffering of separation. So at the age of 9, he became a novice monk. And his other family members encouraged that, and he ordained with with a cousin, I think. So they both became novices. And his grandmother, who sort of took him under his wing again, said, you've got to practice the Dhamma and no need to disrobe, and she really encouraged him. And he had another setback. His cousin, who was a novice, died. And it's quite common in the old days, monks and novices would die from malaria and other illnesses. Often they had very little access to healthcare, medication, hospitals and so on. So that was another shock. When he was a young boy, a novice monk, his cousin who had ordained with him died as well. So twice, he said, he saw the suffering of the impermanence of life and how even the people you love and identify strongly with, one day you've got to separate from them. So he had to deal with that sadness, a big overwhelming emotion. But even as a little kid, as a novice, he already had an interest in meditation, they say. And sometimes, even in Buddhist temples, novice monks often, they're young, so they have their rowdy side. They like to play around, as well as do a lot of study. They would often study in those days. But he'd often, when the other novices were playing around in their free time, he would go off and meditate. And they say Lumpur Wen had that habit, that character trait from a young age. He would learn meditation. He was interested to meditate, to find out how to meditate. So he asked his earliest teachers how to do it. And he'd often go and sit down in a corner and meditate when other kids were playing or studying or chanting. So he had it in him from a young age, but he did spend a lot of his early youth as a novice monk studying the suttas, learning Pali, studying the suttas and the Dhamma. As many other forest ajahns who later became enlightened teachers, they often began their life as monks studying the texts. But like so many of them, once he ordained as a monk, he'd been a monk for a while, learning Pali and studying. He had this yearning to practice meditation and leave the comfort and relative convenience of an urban monastery where he was studying and go out into the forest. And he met some of his teachers, Ajahn Singh, who later became a disciple of Ajahn Mun. They were thinking in the same way as him, that some of the monks he had lived with and was living with, they had this thought, I want to find a teacher, and they often would look for Lumpur Mun. They had this desire to go and find Ajahn Mun, who was considered the foremost meditation master of the era. So this is like in the 1920s, that sort of time, around the time of the First World War. He wanted to go off and find Lumpur Mun. But before that, this teacher Ajahn Singh, if I remember, had another insight into Lumpur Wen's potential. And one day he saw this radiant light around Lumpur Wen, who was very young and inexperienced in meditation, but he already had this kind of bright aura around him. And he remembered that and quoted it to other people. So it seems Lumpur Wen had a lot of barami from a young age. Anyway, he went off looking for Ajahn Mun. He left his studies behind, went off, as so many of these young forest masters did. Went wandering in the forest with the aim of finding Ajahn Mun, but because it's so difficult to find Ajahn Mun in those days, there's no internet, telephone, news. They just go on hearsay. Somebody says he's over in Laos, so they go over into Laos, and that takes weeks, months, even years walking to find the teacher. So he spent a lot of his youth walking with another monk who became another teacher in Chiang Mai, Ajahn Du or Lumpur Du. And they were the best of friends. They both were quite skilled in meditation and put a lot of effort into their meditation practice. And they spent weeks and months wandering the forests of northeast Thailand into Laos, having all kinds of experiences, having to deal with malaria without medication, other than maybe just some basic herbal medication. Having to use their endurance and their samadhi to deal with illnesses such as malaria, dysentery and other things. Going to very quiet places where, he said sometimes he couldn't sleep at night because the number of tigers roaring around him was so many. So having to deal with the fear of illness and disease, the fear of tigers, often getting very unpredictable support. Couldn't be sure where the next meal was coming from. Because a lot of people in those days, especially in these northeast Thai forests, they weren't all Buddhists. Some were, and Buddhists tend to see monks and be very happy to share some simple food with them. But not all of the people were Buddhists. Many of them were what we call animists or spirit worshippers. And when monks came across them, they didn't offer them food or support. Sometimes they were against monks or afraid of them, suspicious of them, or just indifferent to them. So there's no guarantee when you met people out in villages in very remote areas whether you'd even get food or support. So Lumpur Wen is famous for being very tough and enduring through times when he often got very little food or sometimes no food at all. But he would never break his precepts. He would never go around asking people for food. He would just endure if they didn't support him. But he went with Lumpur Du, and they had many days when they didn't get much food or support, and they stay out in the forest meditating. They encountered tigers, ghosts, a lot of ghost stories from Lumpur Wen because he had developed deep samadhi from quite a young age, so encountering what we call pretas, hungry ghosts. There's one story of him encountering a hungry ghost who was so fierce, he tried to teach it the Dhamma because it was bothering the villagers, bothering people, very angry kind of being, and he only was half successful, and then he invited Ajahn Mun later. Once he became a disciple of Ajahn Mun and found Ajahn Mun and studied with him, then he invited Ajahn Mun to come and spread metta and share merit with this ghost who was bothering everyone, and only Ajahn Mun was able to do that successfully. And even Lumpur Wen couldn't completely pacify this very fierce ghost. There's a lot of stories of that, encountering ghosts and beings in other realms, which from time to time he would pass on to the monks as he became more senior. And wandering around the forests of Laos, northeast Thailand, into northern Thailand. And as he became older, he wandered into Burma. No passport, no border controls in those days, and often no food. Many times he would go without much food, depending on who he met. And in getting all the way across to India, and he said the hardest practice was in India. He got the least food and support in India, so he didn't stay long in India, but he went to pay respects to the Buddhist holy sites. And so mostly on foot, occasionally getting a lift or a boat or something, but mostly on foot, just walking. And then back all the way to Thailand. So many, many years wandering around the forests of Thailand, sometimes staying with his teacher, Lumpur Mun, sometimes with Lumpur Du, sometimes on his own. And he said, his main meditation object, following his teacher Lumpur Mun, was using the word Buddho, the meditation word, which comes from Buddha. It means the knowing or the awakened state. Reciting that over and over again, whether walking or sitting. And as the mind gathers, unifies in samadhi, then he would contemplate the body. So he said when he was contemplating, developing insight, he would use the 32 parts of the body, but he would pick one at a time, and really focus in on that one body part to really see it clearly, and then contemplate it as impermanent, as not self. And that was his main meditation teaching. And then in conjunction with reciting Buddha, or recollecting the Buddha, and then contemplating the body, he would also practice metta. And he said, as Buddhists, we should practice spreading metta every day. So he would teach that wherever he went, teach people to develop the meditation on metta, loving kindness, compassion, spreading that in all directions. So they say later in life, during the Vietnam War, because he was so close to the Laotian and even Vietnamese people, he knew them very well, he would spread metta in his later years when he had very powerful mind, powerful samadhi. He'd spread metta to all beings, but particularly to Laos, Vietnam, because of the Communist War. He wanted people to stop fighting, to calm down, to let go of their anger and their desire to destroy and hurt. And he also spread metta to Russia. This is in the 1960s and 70s. And he said in those days, the Russians received his metta quite well. He had some success. The reason he was sending to Russia is because I believe that, they were maybe supporting the North Vietnamese in the Vietnamese War. So he wanted everyone to calm down and cease hostilities. And this is something people often don't realize. Some of these great enlightened monks, people say, well, what do they do to help war and help the suffering of humanity? Well, often they're spreading metta for many hours because they've become enlightened. They've got nothing left they need to do for themselves. They're already free from suffering and rebirth. They've attained nibbana. So then they spread metta in their meditation. So Lumpur Wen told Lumpur Blien, I was spreading metta to Russia, Laos, Vietnam, through all that period, regularly. And he was encouraging people to spread metta for the whole world. No limits, without limits. He said, when you spread metta, you can't limit it. You like this person but not that person, or this group and not that group. You're spreading to all groups. So if you have a war, that's both sides of the war. In this day and age, it might be you spread metta to Ukraine and Russia for them to calm down and cease hostilities. Or wherever there's conflict, whether it's localized, to people, to families, to groups, politics, whatever, or on a global scale. So he really encouraged the practice of metta, and he developed his metta by being in the forest with tigers, ghosts, these kind of beings, and really learning to free his mind from fear. Because once you've freed your mind from fear, then metta and compassion just come naturally. And he said from a very young age, he just gave up to the Dhamma, to the Vinaya, and he had this sense, I'm doing this until I die. I'm going to die in the robes. So whatever obstacle I encounter, I'm not going to give up my practice. I'm going to die in the robes. So I'm just going to have to work through whatever it is. Whether it's fear, which was a big one, discomfort, dissatisfaction, maybe when conditions were hard. He went through a lot of hardship. There was a time when he was really ill with malaria. He thought he might die. And it was raining and he was freezing cold. This is in northern Thailand, which can get cold. And he said he just had to endure his physical illness in the rain. He was out in the forest in the rain with no protection. He just had to endure. And he said, I'll just give up to the Dhamma. If I die, I die. And the same on occasions when he encountered tigers. He said, if this tiger if I've made some bad karma with it, then this is the time it's going to collect its debt and kill me, then so be it. But I've given up to the Dhamma, so I'm not afraid. I'm just going to do my practice. And if it attacks me, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And so he never was harmed, but that's how he was thinking. And these forest monks, often they're thinking in this way. They just give up everything for the Dhamma, for the Vinaya, for their practice. So he's sort of gradually got a reputation in Thailand. Little by little people found out about him, even though this is pre-internet days, as somebody who's very dedicated, very powerful mind, very bright, radiant mind. Even from when he was a little kid, as a novice, he already had a radiant mind. So you can imagine by the time he was 60, 70 years old, how radiant it would be. So the king of Thailand got great faith in him and would come and learn meditation with him. And he just got this reputation amongst monks that he has this bright, radiant mind full of metta. And he encouraged people to, follow his example. That's another thing. He said monks have to be an example. So every day he practiced. He walked through the forests. He practiced metta meditation. He taught people to keep precepts. And he converted many villages that were animist spirit worships, not Buddhists, to Buddhism. He helped. That was one of the things he did that he's appreciated for, like Luang Por Man, his teacher, going to remote places where they didn't have knowledge of Buddhism and teaching people to have faith in Buddhism and give up their spirit worship beliefs. Sometimes they would do sacrifices to the spirits, actually kill chickens and goats and things, and getting them to sort of give up animal sacrifices and some of their superstitions. He said one of the most boring things as a forest monk wandering through the forest is people are always coming to ask you for lucky charms and tips on the lottery and for astrology and all of that. And he said it was really boring, so he's always trying to get them to listen to Dhamma, talk about karma, good karma, bad karma, give up the bad karma, do the good karma, keep precepts, meditate, lead a good life. Over and over again he's having to battle with people's wrong views, wrong beliefs, superstitions. There was one time, he said, an astrologer was very accurate. That was when he was a novice monk in the monastery where he was studying. One of the monks there was renowned as a bit of an astrologer and quite accurate. And this monk said, one day when you're older, you're a young man, you're going to meet one of your ex-wives from past life, and she's going to overwhelm your mind with emotion, the emotion of romance, love. You better be careful, and you'll know when she comes because she's going to come from the east, and she's going to have a beautiful white skin and a face like a leaf from a Bodhi tree, this kind of round face, and she'll be very polite, respectful, very refined in her behavior, and she'll be very attractive to you, and you have to be careful, otherwise you'll disrobe for her and you get married. So this prediction was made when he was a young novice, and then many years later, more than 10 years after that, he was with Luang Por Du, I think, and they were in Laos. I'm not sure if it's on the Mekong River or another river, but they were on a river. They were staying in a hermitage, and they would go to this river to bathe in the evening. And one evening they were there bathing, and they wear a bathing cloth, just washing themselves down next to the river. And a canoe came along with a mother and daughter, and the daughter was a bit younger than him, with this beautiful white skin, the Bodhi leaf face. And he said, as soon as their eyes met, trouble, electricity. He said the energy from her eyes to his and his to hers was just like, uh-oh, love at first sight. So he knew, straight away he knew this is the girl from the prediction, even though the prediction had been made like 14 years before or something. So he knew. So he got his stuff, went back to the hermitage, and he thought, oh, I'm in trouble. If I stay here, I'm going to fall in love with her, and anything could happen. So the next morning, the mother and the daughter came by and offered them some food very early on their way to work, before the monks had gone out on alms round. So they received the food, and he said as he was receiving the food from the mother and daughter, the daughter's just focused on him, fixed her gaze on him, and he kept having to turn away so he didn't look at her because he could see he was getting infatuated with her. And then after their meal, they packed up and that was it. He's off, and he never went back to that place again because he knew it was dangerous for him. So he's learned, he's not renowned for his determination in the practice, his simplicity, poverty. He would never ask people for anything, he just dedicated to the practice. And gradually his reputation grew, and eventually he spent a long time living with Luang Por Plien, who also told many people about the stories and the life of Luang Por Wen, and some of his psychic powers, his skill with jhana, his skill with body contemplation and vipassana, and passed on a lot of that information. So that's how I heard about Luang Por Wen's life. And Luang Por Plien said as a teacher he was quite tough. He would scold Luang Por Plien for sleeping too much, even when Luang Por Plien sometimes only slept a couple of hours a night. Luang Por Wen would still say, you're sleeping too much. So it gives you a whole new perspective on laziness. Even 2 or 3 hours can be too much for Luang Por Wen. And he would teach monks to not spend too much time on distractions and things that are not conducive to the practice. Just focus on developing mindfulness and developing their mind in meditation. He said sometimes he would try too hard in his practice, so that can also be a problem. Luang Por Wen said there's one period where he gave up 2 of the postures, sitting and lying down, so he'd only stand or walk. And he said it just exhausted him, as you would imagine. Even though he already had a very strong, bright mind, it just exhausted him. It was undoable, he said. It's just not practical, not sustainable. So at least he tried it, and then decided it's too much for him. So he would push himself, as he admitted, sometimes too far, but always pushing himself until he reached Nibbana. He's always learning, pushing himself to go further. So a very good example to other monks. So he's always been greatly loved by monks. And probably the thing that made him most famous was when the fighter pilots from the Thai Air Force flying over the Chiang Mai area saw him up in the clouds, or saw an image of him, we don't know, but they saw him up in the clouds and later came to find him, drove in a jeep to find him in his monastery, but he wouldn't admit it. They said, we saw you up in the clouds, and he said, that's crazy, only birds go up in the clouds. So he didn't admit that he was up in the clouds meditating, but they saw him and they were sure they saw him, and when they saw him in real life they said, that's the monk we saw up in the clouds. And prior to seeing him in the sky as they were flying, they didn't know him, so it's not like they were sort of imagining it based on what they'd seen before. They hadn't seen him before. So that story went on to the front page of the newspapers, and by then, that was towards the end of his life. By the time he died, he was just a national icon. The king loved him, many people loved him, would go and see him. I made several pilgrimages to his chedi just after he died to pay respects to his relics. And when his funeral, his cremation took place, they say 1 million people attended. So it was a huge event. I remember that because Ajahn Pasano and some of the other monks from Wat Pah Pong, Ajahn Chah's monastery, they went up to that funeral to learn how to do a funeral for Ajahn Chah, because they knew Ajahn Chah's would be of a similar size, because this Ajahn Chah also, a national figure by then. So they learned how to do a big cremation for an enlightened master, so they could use some of that experience for Ajahn Chah. So a great monk, some of his teachings have been translated. You can find them on the net, and you can go to his monastery if you're in Thailand, pay respects to his relics, and there's a waxworks model of him there as well. So maybe I'll leave that tonight, and we can always talk again next time, and we wish you well in your practice.